Amen. Well, I am excited today, not just because I've drunk coffee, though I have, but I'm excited today because we are beginning our series on the Ten Commandments. And this is going to be a big series for us as a church. You may have noticed that there's been a bit more promotion in this series than other series, and that is for a reason. It is the hope of our shepherds, and frankly, it is my hope that the Ten Commandments will become very important in the life of this church, that they will become the framework that me and you understand our life together as the people of God, that they will come to shape how we view God and particularly his character and how we worship him with the whole of our lives in light of that they will come to shape how we relate to one another inside the church in order to build up the body of Christ and how we relate with people outside of the church as a kingdom of priests, those who bear God's name and God's image inside of God's world. And so we're going to take on the Ten Commandments one at a time, and we are going to pick them apart, okay? We're going to seek to understand how they would have been understood in their ancient Near Eastern context. We're going to seek to understand what they first and foremost reveal, not about what me and you are supposed to do, but about God. We're going to seek to understand the positive implication to each negatively stated command, which, by the way, 8 out of the 10 commandments are negatively stated. We're going to pick these commandments apart. But my hope is that more than us picking these commandments apart is that they will pick us apart, that they will put up a mirror to our hearts and our minds and our souls, that they would challenge us, and they would, hear this, that they would actually change us as a people. However, before we can do any of that, before we can pick these commandments apart so that they might pick us apart, we do need to spend a couple weeks orienting ourselves around these commandments as a whole. We need to understand how are these supposed to function inside the life of the church before we even take any of them on individually. And so next week, we're actually going to unpack what I believe to be 6 common myths about the Ten Commandments, okay? We're going to unpack 6 common myths about the Ten Commandments next week. And this morning, what we're going to do is we're going to hopefully immerse ourselves in the story in which the Ten Commandments are given to us. And that is the story of the Exodus, God delivering his people out of bondage, out of slavery, and then into his care. And by the way, the important part today is to understand that there's a second part of that it's not just out of bondage, but it is into his care. And the question that I want to frame this conversation as we try to grapple with the whole story of the book of Exodus this morning, as we try to immerse ourselves in it, the thing that I really want us to do, the question I really want us to ask is this: what is salvation for the Christian? When we ask that question, are you saved? Or we've had it asked of us, what do we mean? That's the question today. Now, obviously, the concept of salvation is an important concept in the American Christian church. Think about all the questions that you hear asked in our Christian. Are you saved? Have you been baptized? That's the Church of Christ asking that question. More laughter next time. Or have you accepted Jesus Christ into your heart as your Lord? And you can even finish the sentence. That's how deeply ingrained the idea of salvation being important is into our psyche in our American Christian culture. However, if we're honest with ourselves, we at best only have a surface level understanding of what salvation means for our lives, if we have any at all. We know it's important. Think about when we taught Path to Wisdom in class a couple weeks ago. We know the what, but we don't know the why. We know that salvation is important, but we don't know why. We have no clue what it actually means for our existence in this world. And I think the main root for our lack of understanding comes from the fact that we've only really told half the biblical story of salvation. We get you dunked. We get you to say a prayer. Magically, you're saved. But then what? But then what? We get you dumped, man. We get you baptized. We get to add you to our number. And then what? What's next? You see, in our American Christian culture, we have focused a lot on the fact that me and you, that we have been saved from the reign of sin and death and the curse and their consequence, most importantly, hell. And we focus a lot on the fact that we are saved from hell, but we have spent very little time focused on the fact that we are not just saved from sin and death and the curse and their consequence of hell, but we are also saved to a certain kind of life. That we have been saved not just merely to be saved, but we have been saved for a purpose. We are not just saved from. The point of today is this. We have not just been saved from, but we have been saved to and for. We've been saved to a certain kind of life. And really, we see this inside of the story of the Exodus. And by the way, the way we deal with the story of the Exodus, okay? Now, some of you, I don't want you to get too smart on me, okay? Don't get too smart on me, but I have a question. And if you're new here, you're allowed to talk in church because I need this dialogue, okay? And I need you in this moment. So, what does Moses famously tell Pharaoh on behalf of God? Let my people go. Now, did you know, which most of you do, I understand that most of you do, but we've only focused on the let my people go part. What is the next part? Okay, let my people go, but then what? What is it? So that they may worship me. We have only, think about, are y'all fans of the movie Prince of Egypt? I mean, there's some, as the youths would say these days, there's some real bangers in there, okay? Some real bops, all right? And in all seriousness, there's some great music in the Prince of Egypt. It's so good that that's even become like a Broadway play, I think the Prince of Egypt has. I mean, there's some great songs in the Prince of Egypt. I love it. Like that opening song, it's a good song, okay? It's a great song. And do you know, in the famous song, Deliver Us, the only part of that phrase, let my people go so that they may worship me, what's the only part of the phrase they use? Let my people go. There's no sense of we've been saved to anything. We've just been saved from something. Think about the way they tell the story of the Exodus and the Prince of Egypt. By the way, the Prince of Egypt being Moses. Think about the way they tell the story. They stop, Exodus is 40 chapters. They stop in chapter 16. They tell less than half the story, but we bought it as the whole story. We know that we've been saved from something, but we have no sense that we've been saved to something. And because that is the fact in the American Christian church, it has manifested itself in, I think, two different extremes. And the first of these extremes is what I would call cultural Christianity, okay? So the first of these extremes would be called cultural Christianity, in which we are saved from the bondage of sin and death and the curse and their consequence, hell. And then, guess what? We just get to move on with life as if nothing's happened, all right? Cultural Christianity. We might attend church a few times each week because we've been saved, and we might even engage in some behavioral modification because of it. But at our core, we are still the same. Nothing inside of us has actually changed. Some externals may have changed. Some modification may have happened, but there's certainly been no inner transformation of the heart and the soul and the mind. Think about it this way, right? Sociologists tend to think that there are three main questions that we ask of ourselves, right? Who are we? Identity. Who are my people? Where do I belong? Right? Belonging, and then purpose, right? What am I here for? Right? Those are the three main questions. Who am I? Who are my people, and what is my purpose? Where do I fit in? What's the point of all this? And here's the thing. I think what's happened is we may have had some behavioral modification because we've been saved. We go to church. They teach us good morals. We try to live by them. But we still answer these questions of identity and purpose and belonging in the things of this world rather than in Christ and his body, the church. There's modification, but there's certainly no transformation. The fancy word for this, the technical term for this is called assimilation. And all assimilation means is that we have blended into the culture around us. We don't look any different from the world because we have been saved. Think about it this way. Because we do not know the kind of life to which we've been saved as Christians, we look just like the rest of the world. The Christian philosopher Dallas Willard, he died now actually quite a while ago, about 10 years ago. But he's very famous, and he coined a very famous phrase called vampire Christianity. Okay, and I've used this before. I've used this illustration, but here's the quote that it originates from. This is the way he puts it. This is the way he kind of captures this idea of cultural Christianity and the problems inherent in it. He says, this heresy has created the impression that it is quite reasonable to be a vampire Christian. One, in effect, says to Jesus, I'd like a little bit of your blood, please, but I don't care to be your student or to have your character. Okay, your blood, it has saved me from the reign of sin, death, and the curse, and its consequence, hell, but I certainly have no interest in what you have saved me to and what you have saved me for. I'd like a little bit of your blood, please, but I don't care to be your student or to have your character. In fact, won't you just excuse me while I get on with my life, and I'll see you up in heaven. This is cultural Christianity, vampire Christianity. And by the way, vampire Christians, because we're only concerned with Jesus' blood, because it covers us and it saves us from hell, but we're certainly not concerned about what it saves us to. So that's one extreme, I think, that's manifested itself in the American Christian culture. The other extreme would be something that's often referred to as culture wars. There's cultural Christianity, and then we've kind of swung the pendulum in the opposite direction, and now there's culture wars, all right? In this paradigm, it's all about being against culture, okay? This happens when we equate being saved away from the reign of sin and death and the curse to being saved away from the culture in which we live, okay? So we've equated two things that shouldn't be equated. Does that make sense? We equate being saved from the reign of sin and death and the curse to being saved from the culture in which we lived. We've been saved from the world, right? Think about the language I've been saved from the world, right? Or, like often the illustration is used about the world's flooding, but God's offered us a life raft, and that is salvation. You heard that phrase? So the world is going to hell in a handbasket, right? And I need to be saved from that. In this paradigm, the world is seen as a bad and hear this, an irredeemable place. And so the only logical response to that is to either abandon that world, or because it's irredeemably bad, if you want to be a super Christian, what should you do? You don't just abandon it, you attack it. Think about it this way. When there's no vision of life to which we've been saved, we define ourselves in opposition to what we've been saved from. All right? We're searching for meaning in our existence. And we want more, and you want more than just, I have been saved away from these things so that I can be just like the rest of the world. And you're like, man, I want more than that, right? And by the way, that's a good impulse. And so what do? We say, well, I'm going to find my identity. I'm going to define my life around what I've been saved from. And so we answer these questions of identity and purpose and belonging, in that paradigm, all right? I am who I am because I'm not like them. I'm a Republican because I'm not a Democrat. I'm a Democrat because I'm not a Republican. This is called negative partisanship, by the way. I belong to this group because we're not like that group. Those people, man, they're X, Y, and Z. They're this way, but we aren't that. And when I find my identity and my belonging in those things, I've been saved from those things. And that is how I find my identity and my belonging. The only purpose I can have in life is what? To attack the thing from which I've been saved. How often have we seen American Christianity reduced to nothing more than being against the world that God declared good in the beginning and sacrificed his son to redeem? How often have we seen American Christianity be reduced to nothing more than being against the world that God created in the beginning? And God saw what he made, and it was very... John 3:16, for God so loved thee, that he sent his one and only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal. We haven't just been saved from something, right? We've been saved to something. Now, when I put it that way, this idea, we've seen American Christianity be reduced to, just being against the world, that none of us would say, well, that's what I believe. But it's so alluring and it's so tempting, and we often fall into it. I've fallen into this because think about it, right? In this paradigm, what it means to be holy means to be more against the world. And the more against the world you are, the more holy you are. Or the more removed from the world, the more you've abandoned the world, the more holy you are. It's so alluring, isn't it? The one who's most against is most holy. But when we think of it that way, we've misunderstood the meaning of the word holy. What does the word holy just most blatantly, most directly mean? Yet again, you can talk in church. Set apart. Okay, so we, in this vision of holy, we've been set apart from the world. We've been set apart from culture. We've not just been set apart from culture, we've been set apart for the world. We're not just set apart from the world, we are set apart for the world. We are set apart from the world for the sake of the world. And with that, we turn our attention to the book of Exodus, because that being set apart from the world for the sake of the world is the story of the book of Exodus. Think about the book of Exodus, right? We like the let my people go part. After 400 years of slavery, God hears the cries of his people, and he raises up Moses. And then we get the back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh, and then Moses and Pharaoh. And Moses says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. But let my people go, right? And Pharaoh refuses. And then let my people go, and Pharaoh refuses. And let my people go, and Pharaoh refuses again and again and again. And so God sends the 10 plagues, which, by the way, I've heard Jerry used to mispronounce the word plagues. I can't remember. Right? Yeah, you see something. Okay, yeah. Jerry, if you watch this, not that Jerry would watch my sermons, but Jerry, if you watch this, that was for you. Jerry's great. Jerry, I love Jerry. Jerry's been so kind and gracious to me. But we get that back and forth between Moses and Pharaoh. Let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. Let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. And then we get the 10 plagues, right? Which ends in the story of the Passover, right? In which the Holy Spirit of God descends upon Egypt and kills all the firstborn children, except for those who have wiped the lamb's blood on their doorpost. And the Spirit of God passes over those doors, right? And those firstborn are spared. The Israelites then flee from Egypt, and they cross the Red Sea, and then the Egyptian army is chasing after them, and the Red Sea closes up behind them, and then the movie The Prince of Egypt ends. And the story is over, right? 15 chapters out of a 40-chapter book have been told. Our question remains, but then what? The story is over, and we get to live happily ever after, go along your merry way, as the Prince of Egypt would have us believe. You've been saved from Egypt so that you, can become Egypt yourself, I guess. You are now a nation, and you get to become strong, and you get to be just like the rest of the nations. The way we tell the story, that's a reasonable, kind of logical next step. Or maybe it's the story is over, your life is now defined by the part of the story that is always told. You've been saved from Egypt, and so your life is defined by your hatred of Egypt. They oppressed you, and now your goal in life is to oppress them as they oppressed you. By the way, the Israelites sometimes took that very seriously. And even though they were supposed to be kind to the foreigner and stranger in their land, what do? They oppressed them, just like they were oppressed. By the way, I think it's important for us to note, the way we tend to deal with passages is we pick them apart, right? And I'm going to take a verse. Today, my text, I think, is 5 verses, And I think it's 4 verses. That's very common, right? That is not the way that the ancient Near Eastern Israelites would have understood the story of the Exodus. They wouldn't have heard 5 verses here and 5 verses there. They would have certainly not taken the 10 Commandments one by one and unpacked each of them, right? They lived in an oral storytelling culture. And so they would have sat around the campfire, or the proverbial campfire at least, or the pillar of fire, you know what I mean? Sat around it, and somebody would have read the entirety of the book of Exodus. They would have never heard the first part of the story without the second. They would have never heard the let my people go part without the so that they may worship me part. And yet that is what we have done. You see, the story of the book of Exodus doesn't end with the crossing of the Red Sea and then the Red Sea closing up behind the Egyptian army. After saving his people from their bondage to slavery and idolatry, right? So the Israelites had spent 400 years in Egypt. Do you not think that they began to worship the Egyptian gods? We talked about this in class. Think about it, right? In their worldview, the Egyptian gods were more powerful than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been slaves in Egypt. if their God was technically more powerful. So you don't think they began to worship the Egyptian gods? So they bought into, they weren't just slaves, but they bought into all the idolatry of Egypt. And so the story of the Exodus, right, after saving his people from their bondage to slavery, after saving them from their bondage to idolatry, God gives them what we often call the law. You are free, and the first thing you need are rules. And we'll talk more about that paradigm next week and that paradox next week. But what you need is rules, and that law is summarized best and first and foremost in the Ten Commandments. And so hear this. When we think about the Ten Commandments, this is how me and you should think about them. They are the life to which we have been saved. The Ten Commandments are the life to which me and you have been saved. You don't just move on with your life and live like the nations. You don't just live in opposition to the nations. You weren't saved from Egypt. You were saved to a certain kind of life. This then is how you should live. I've saved you so that you can live by these rules. And we'll spend the rest of this spring semester immersing ourselves in what that vision of life is like. We're going to spend the rest of this spring semester envisioning and trying to capture what that means for me and you in our lives as individuals, in our life as a whole church, as we live out our lives in the world. We're going to unpack all of that, okay? But today what I want us to do is I want us to look at not just what God has saved us to, but what he has saved us for. How does God frame this new life to which he has saved us? How does God understand let me put it this way. What is God's purpose for this life? He hasn't just saved us from something, he has saved us to something. What is his purpose for saving us to this? What are we saved for? And with that, I want you to pick up with me in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. Now, if you obey me and fully keep my covenant, okay, that's the Ten Commandments. If you obey me and you live into this life to which I have saved you, out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. You will be for me a holy, set-apart nation. Not just set apart from Egypt, but set apart for the sake of Egypt. Think about this phrase, kingdom of priests. This is God's purpose for the Ten Commandments. This is God's purpose for the life that he has saved us, not just from, but for and to. This is purpose for it. To be a kingdom of priests. The way one scholar puts it, he says, we're not just a kingdom with priests, but we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. So what do priests do? They represent God to the, okay, you say people, God to the, and the people to, all right? So the priests represent God to the people and the people to God, okay? And what the priests did on a micro scale for the people of Israel as a whole is supposed to do for the rest of the world. They're supposed to represent the world to God and God to the world. By interacting with Israel, the world is supposed to come and understand the character of the one true living God. And they're supposed to see it, and they're supposed to say, man, that is sweet. Come and taste and see that the Lord is good. That's what people are supposed to experience as Israel lived by the Ten Commandments. As we live out the life to which we've been saved, that's supposed to be the world's experience with us. All right? That is what we've been saved for. This is the way one scholar puts it. He says the role, if I can get that next slide, the role of priests within Israel is to mediate between God and the people. And thus, on an international scale, God is called to mediate between the Lord and all the nations. Israel is to be a display people, a showcase to the world of how being in covenant with God changes a people. Okay, so just pause there for a second. Cultural Christianity, not an option, is it? This is supposed to change us. This is supposed to radically transform our lives. This is not about mere behavioral modification. This is about whole life transformation. This is supposed to, our salvation radically changes us. All right? It radically changes us. There's supposed to be a showcase to the world of how being in covenant with Yahweh changes the people. The whole of Israel's experience, including family life and law and politics and economics and recreation, will reflect God's character and God's original creational intention for human life. Israel's life under God is to testify. So as we live out this life of transformation, it is supposed to testify to the living presence of God within God's people. It is to be such a full life and such a rich life that the nations of the earth will be drawn to it. Come and taste and see that the Lord is good. And in this way, Israel will fulfill its Abrahamic covenant to bless all nations. This is what we've been saved for. And we're going to spend the rest of this semester, as I said, unpacking this vision of life to which we've been saved. But as we close this morning, I simply have two kind of things I want to communicate to you, and I want us to get before we can really start grappling with the Ten Commandments. These are two things that we need to really wrestle with, okay? And the first is this: our salvation submerges us, and no, that's not just a play on the words for baptism. All right? To put it another way, our salvation is more than just a ticket to heaven. A salvation that only saves us from sin and death and the curse and their consequence, hell, is no Christian understanding of salvation at all. If that is our understanding of salvation, we have an unchristian understanding of salvation. However, that is exactly what cultural Christianity or vampire Christianity tries to sell us. Salvation is nothing more than a ticket to heaven, and that's a good thing. It costs you nothing. You just get to keep on keeping on. You can just keep on going as you always have. You've been saved. You now have a ticket to heaven when you die. Congratulations. But think about the implications of this. The idea here is that me and you, that we are saved, if we're just telling that story, that we are saved from the reign of sin and death and the curse, that means that we think that we're just saved into some sort of neutral. And there's two grave, heinous issues with that. The first is there's no such thing as neutral. The lie of the status quo is its existence. We are always either atrophying or growing, moving forward or slowly dying. Some of you know this all too well, but the harder and more you grasp on to the way things are, the more they tend to slip out of your hands, right? There's no such thing as being saved into neutral, because the status quo is a lie. Even more so than this, the reason why this is such a problematic view, that we've just been saved from the world so that we can be like the world, is that the life to which, let me put it this way. The life that we currently live is not the life for which you were made. The life that you currently live is not the life for which you were made. This is a common platitude in our culture, but you were meant for more. All right? And here's the thing. It's a platitude when our culture says it, because our culture doesn't provide you a pathway to what you've been made for. All right? It's just kind of a nice thing. Oh, you were made for more. Isn't that not? I feel good after hearing that. Thank you. That's so kind of you to say. Our culture wants you to believe that you were made for more, and it costs you nothing to get it. Scripture tells us the truth. You were made for more, and the way to get it is by dying to yourself. Forever will try to save their life will lose it, but whoever is willing to lose their life for me and the sake of the gospel, they will what? Find it. Life is only found by actually submission. I mean, this is the most countercultural thing in the world. Life is found through submission. Submission to God's law and God's reign and God's rule. You were meant for more, but it cost you absolutely everything. But in giving up absolutely everything, you get even more than everything. The Ten Commandments, hear this, they are not a list of restrictions about your joy. They are an invitation to life and life abundant. Salvation submerges you in life abundant. But the only way to life is through death. Don't buy into the lie of vampire Christianity that it costs you nothing because you want it to cost you something, because you were meant for more than this. The life which you now live is not the life for which you were made. You were made for the Ten Commandments. The second point I want us to wrestle with this morning is this, and that is that salvation sends. It sends us out into the world. We are not saved from the world. We are not restored to our originally intended life to be either superior or separate from the world, but rather we are saved from the world to be sent back into the world and invite others into a restored life. God didn't just give us this gift. You are blessed to be a blessing. God transforms us so that we might be his agents of transformation out in the world. I mean, think about the story of the book of Exodus, right? You are no longer slaves, but you will be for me a kingdom of priests. That is their moment of transformation. You now have a new identity, and you'll spend the rest of your life trying to live into that identity. And as you do, that identity sends you out into the nations so that they might come to know the life that I have now given you. That's the story of the book of Exodus. See, contrary to popular belief, it isn't the more holy we are, the more removed we are from the world. Rather, it is the more holy we are, the more engaged we are in the world. You are not just set apart from, you are set apart for. We see this really played out in James chapter 1, verse 27. Pretty famous verse. It's a great summary of the Christian faith. Pure and faultless religion. Some of you are getting your minds triggered. Pure and faultless religion is this: to look after orphans and widows and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. However, our American translations are trying to do us a favor, but in trying to do us a favor, they actually do us a great disservice. That last "and" shouldn't be in the sentence. It isn't this. It is not pure and faultless religion is this, to look after orphans and widows and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. It is pure and faultless religion is this, to look after orphans and widows in order to be unpolluted from the world. It is only as we engage the world that we become holy. It is only as we engage the world as agents of God's transformation, because we've been transformed, that we live into the holiness that God has intended for us. We've not just been saved from, but we have been saved to and for. Salvation sends. We don't live out the Ten Commandments amidst the quiet confines of the church, a holy huddle away from the world. We live them out amidst the darkness of the world so that the world might come to find light. Think about the first commandment: have no other gods beside me. Have no other gods in front of my face. We'll take that on in 2 weeks. But think about it. As we live out that command, not just inside the church, but as we live that command out in the world, and others see what the life of freedom that only has God, one God on the throne, rather than many gods on the throne, they see the freedom of that life. What might they come to see? Life and life abundant. Think about the fourth commandment, which is the commandment of the Sabbath. And by the way, it's not just you shall remember the Sabbath. It's you shall remember the Sabbath. And it's all these things. And by the way, even your servants, you don't let them work. Okay, so as you live as a just society, and not just a just society, but a merciful society that allows even your servants to rest, a world that is hustled and hurried and haggard, they might come to find the true rest that only God can provide. Think about the eighth commandment, which is do not steal, and its positive implication, which is be generous. Okay, as the world sees your generosity, and your generosity is not just to the church, but it's supposed to manifest itself out in the world. And as the world sees that generosity, what might they come to find? That God is a generous God, and he is the giver of all good things. That the doxology is actually true. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow, not just some. Do you see the point? Your salvation sends you. You've been not just saved from the world, but you have been saved to a certain kind of life. And that life is meant to be lived out in the public square. And as we live out that life in the public square, as we live out this restored and redeemed life, the world comes to taste and see that the Lord is good. Think about it this way. The reason I had Genesis 1 and Genesis 12 read for us before Exodus chapter 19 is because Exodus 19 is actually just another iteration of the same thing. We are made to be God's image in this world, right? What does it mean to be God's image other than it means to be a kingdom of priests? We image God to creation. We image God to the world. Nothing has changed. This is the life for not just that you've been saved for, this is the life that you were originally made for. The Ten Commandments are the life for which you were not just saved, but the life for which you were made. And if you want to realign yourself with that life this morning, or you want to enter into that life this morning, through the waters of baptism. By the way, we actually have a baptism today. It's going to be at 1 p.m., so you can go to lunch and come back if you want to. Connor Andrews is going to be baptized. We're very excited about that. But if you want to realign your life with the way it was intended to be from the very beginning, or if you want to immerse yourself in the water baptism,